Thank you so much for being here. We have a very interesting guest for you tonight with a fascinating history. Chris Hedges is with us. He is a renowned Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, author, and activist. And you probably know him from his current work, maybe from one of his dozen best selling books, including his latest, The Greatest Evil is War. Maybe you've watched his show On Contact, which was on RT, or his current show, The Chris Hedges Report, found on the Real News Network. Perhaps you read his Substack or heard his podcast of the same name, The Chris Hedges Report. He's often controversial, giving opinions about domestic issues, capitalism, socialism, and of course, war. But what you might not know about Chris are the stories from his extensive background as a foreign correspondent. Chris spent almost 2 decades trotting around the globe covering some of the world's most dangerous conflict zones. 15 of those years he spent working for the New York Times. Hedges began his career in Latin America, where he reported on the conflicts in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, witnessing some of the worst violence imaginable. While covering the first Gulf War, he refused to be restricted by the military and set out on his own to get the real story and was subsequently arrested. He was taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard during the Shiite uprising, where he was held for a week. Hedges reported on the atrocities committed by Saddam Hussein in the Kurdish-held parts of northern Iraq, which led to a bounty being offered for his assassination. During the Yugoslav wars, Hedges reported on massacres, ethnic cleansings campaigns, and assassinations. He traveled with armed units of the Kosovo Liberation Army, and after 9/11, Hedges was based in Paris, covering al-Qaeda throughout the Middle East. He's had an extensive career, literally in the trenches, risking his life. His experiences as a journalist make his anti-war positions all the more compelling. And tonight, we're going to hear some of his incredible stories, as well as whether or not he thinks the US is tumbling headfirst into a conflict of our own. Chris Hedges, welcome to the show. It's so great to see you.
Thanks, Kim.
I want to dive into some of these past experiences that you have. That you have a phenomenal career as a journalist, probably also very traumatizing, I would imagine, seeing the things that you've seen and experiencing the things that you've experienced. I'll ask you a general question to start off. Out of all the conflicts you've seen, out of everything that you've covered, which one would you say is the worst?
I would say any conflict, and I've covered several, of course, any conflict that devolves into a fratricide, which is what happened in El Salvador. I covered the war there for 5 years. That's what happened in Bosnia. And that's because there's so little that differentiates one side from another. So you retreat into kind of absurdities, what Freud called the narcissism of minor difference. Everyone in Bosnia spoke Serbo-Croatian, but suddenly Bosnian became a language in and of itself. People who weren't particularly religious in any way. This was true in Yugoslavia under Tito and communism. Religion was not a major force in society. Suddenly found their identities, religious identities. I remember once in the war in Bosnia, I was with a battalion of shaheeds. That's the Arabic word for martyr. I also spent 7 years in the Middle East, of course. And so that meant that a family member had been killed in the war, and everybody wore a green headband, and we were waiting to go into battle. There's a lot of dead time in war zones, so we had several hours. And they were talking to me, and they found out I'd been in the Middle East, and they wanted to know what it was like. And then it got to the Quran, and out of the 900 people there, the soldiers there, I was the only one who had actually read the Quran. So that's a kind of example. I think the fratricides, and they very swiftly devolve into horrific, atrocity-driven situations, torture, mutilation. And I think that is, again, an attempt to not only dehumanize people who are very similar to you, but create a wider divide. I mean, I can remember in Bosnia going into towns where people had been crucified on the sides of barns. In El Salvador, there was the death squads routinely mutilated. In fact, they hated the press. They had a slang term for us called the piriquaco, which is kind of roughly translated as I don't know if you can swear on your show, but it's a nasty little word. And and so they wanted to send a threat. We were always getting death threats, but they wanted to send a physical threat. And you only cover a war zone in daylight hours. So we would usually leave the parking lot of the Camino Real in San Salvador at about dawn, about 6 in the morning. One morning we got there, one of the three bodies, and there were notes stuffed in their mouths saying, "You're next." And it was probably three innocent campesinos who had nothing to do with the conflict, and they were just kind of used to deliver a message. So yeah, fratricides are always the dirtiest and worst of the
Can you
conflicts that I've.
define that word for us, just for those that I don't know what it means specifically.
Fratricide is a war against brothers. I mean, literally. But it's a war against people who, bear far more in common than are virtually coming out of the same community. I mean, for instance, in the war in Bosnia, in the city of Mostar, at one point the trench lines were separated simply by a highway, and these people had all grown up together, so they were killing each other during the day, and at night they would shout out and go, "Hey, how is Slavica?" Because they went to school with the guy's sister, back and forth. So yeah, those fratricides are always, for me, the most horrific. I mean, every war is horrific, but those are kind of the dirtiest conflicts I've covered.
And how do they devolve into that? So you're talking about this isn't like what we see right now with Ukraine and Russia. These are two different countries, or even a civil war where maybe there's one side and a revolution. This is something a bit different. How does it even get to this point?
Well, we're watching, we're barreling towards antagonistic divisions within the United States. You get to that point when you can no longer communicate. So you retreat into a particular mythology. And of course, we've already done that, which is not grounded in verifiable fact. And then you can no longer communicate with the other, and you begin to demonize the other. I mean, the Serbs used to say that the Bosniaks, the Muslims, were all fundamentalists, and Al Qaeda was ridiculous. These guys in Bosnia I was with, the Muslims could drink just about anybody under the table, and had very little religious background or understanding. But uh, you break your society down into antagonistic tribes that can no longer communicate and that speak in myth. And then and what happens is that their particular media entities will cater to. So the Serbs had their media entities, the Croats had theirs, the Muslims had theirs. They cater to that particular demographic, and part of catering to that demographic is demonizing the other. It took 4 years of that kind of hate speech before anybody crossed into Bosnia and began carrying out ethnic cleansing. So here in the United States, I see a very similar. I'm not saying we're going to devolve into civil war, but we have already broken down the society and decides that can no longer speak to each other because the roots of how they view the world around them are so radically different. How do societies get like that? Well, they get like that largely through economic collapse and a rupturing of the social bonds that connect you to the society, that give you a place, a sense of worth, work with dignity. All of that is gone. And so that is an assault against identity. And so you go to seek an alternative identity, which is usually grounded in myth. So I was in Montgomery, Alabama, a couple of years ago with Brian Stevenson, the great civil rights attorney. And we were walking through the city, half of Montgomery's black, and he was showing me all the Confederate memorials, which were just had proliferated everywhere. And he said most of these were put up in the last 10 years. And I said, Brian, that's exactly what happened in Yugoslavia. When Yugoslavia broke down, people suddenly found their worth in this mythic narrative about the Serbs and the field of blackbirds when they were defeated by the Turks and this kind of stuff. So societies that become uh, deformed by social inequality and are in deep economic distress. Yugoslavia, of course, was beset by hyperinflation, as was Weimar. Then you rupture those social bonds, that sense of place, that sense of hope in the future, and of course, there's no hope for you, and there's no hope for your kids. Then it kind of creates these uh, retreats into that last readout of identity, which is not reality based. I mean, I wrote a book on the Christian right, and argued, I think, in that book, that these people retreated into this mythical world perpetuated by the Christian right because the real world, the world of rational thought, and had failed them. I mean, not worse than failed them, almost destroyed them in evictions and substance abuse and domestic abuse and bankruptcies and everything else. And that's where you get these self-destructive pathologies where the society, what do we lose, 100,000 people a year to opioid or overdoses, suicides skyrocketing, gambling, alcoholism, sexual sadism. I'm very anti-porn. All of that is, uh, you engage in behaviors that are uh, self-destructive. And it's interesting, the French sociologist Emile Durkheim, when he writes about suicide, he talks about very aggressive militia type groups or people who carry out acts of violence. He said that those people are driven by desires for self annihilation. And I think we see that in the mass shootings where these alienated individuals go in and carry out these mass shootings, and then it's either suicide or suicide by cop. Very rare. You have a few, Dylan Roof, and a few who get picked up and charged, but I don't know the percentages, but it's certainly a significant percentage are killed, and probably know they're going to be killed.
I think a lot of Americans, we've been very spoiled throughout our lives to not have conflict here on our soil. We definitely engage in
Yeah,
conflicts
let
around the
me just
world.
interject. Let me just interject. That's true if you're white. That's not true
Right.
if you're
Yeah. Right. Um, but as far as an actual civil war here on American soil, we haven't experienced that. And so a lot of Americans, I think this is just something that could never really happen to us. That, we watch these other societies crumble, break down, go into revolutions, go into wars, but it wouldn't happen here, that we are evolved from that. Um, but you point this out, that that society can reach this point, and it takes a mix of things to have this happen. Now, I come from a family of Vietnamese refugees, and my grandmother has an incredible story. She's still alive today, but she escaped northern Vietnam when there was a war that broke out there. Then she went to the south, then had to leave the south, and then she was in Iran when the revolution happened there, and had to leave. She was living in Iran at the time, and then had to leave Iran. So a living person today has in their lifetime 3 times had to escape this sort of crumbling of their homes, crumbling of their society. So there, people see this, they see this happen, they think that everything's fine, and then one day it isn't. Here in the United States, we've never had to really truly face this, but we're kind of reaching a point now where potentially this could happen. I mean, I'm curious of your thoughts on this, because we have hyperinflation that potentially could be coming in the near future as these countries around the world start ditching the dollar. Do you think the mix of, when you've seen these conflicts around the world, do you think the United States is reaching a point where we may see this happen in our own country?
I think it could. I think we're certainly moving in that direction. And if you go back to the American Civil War, and I had a lot of ancestors who fought in it, um, it was uh, just catastrophic slaughter, kind of Napoleonic tactics with repeating rifles. So, uh, yes, I mean, I think that's what those of us who have covered conflicts, we see a lot of flashing red lights here. And how would that manifest itself? Uh, we already have had, what is it, 170 mass shootings this year or something? I mean, it's what, one and a half a day or something. This should be. It's very disturbing, the fact that Americans have an arsenal of, I think, 400 million weapons. I don't know how many AR-15s or 14s but certainly in the millions. Um, uh, so for instance, in Bosnia, when I covered the war, you had a proliferation of small militias, and you never quite knew, which side, when you went into a town, which side was, which militia had control. I mean, it was very hard to read. And you could see something like that here. I mean, I don't think we're there yet, um, but there are a lot of echoes of Yugoslavia that I see within the United States. Hyperinflation is key. I've lived through two hyperinflations, one in Argentina and one in Nicaragua. Because when you get hyperinflation, which really means that your money is worthless, then all credibility of the ruling system is shattered, uh, and uh, and that's just pervasive. Has a major effect in disrupting centralized power, uh, and hopefully we won't get there. I mean, we are watching the world move toward away from the hegemony of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. That will have a devastating effect on the economy. It'll make the sustenance of empire impossible. We won't be able to afford it because we pay for it by debt. We pay for it by selling treasury bonds. And if the dollar drops in value, which is what would happen if it was no longer the world's reserve currency, we don't know. Alfred McCoy argues up to 2/3. But we saw with the pound sterling in the 1950s when the pound sterling was dropped as the world's reserve currency. It was devastating, created a huge depression in Great Britain. We would be no different. So, this is where historians always talk about how empires are actually very fragile entities because they're not self-contained. The structure that facilitates empire is global, uh, and uh, and therefore vulnerable. And so, yeah, I hate to think that we're headed in that direction. But if we look at the media, it's completely siloed. With each side engaging in the same kind of activities that I saw in Yugoslavia. Everybody has their own conspiracy theories. One side has QAnon, the other side has RussiaGate. Neither one is grounded in reality from where I am, in my perspective. And the real problem, deindustrialization, the disenfranchisement of the working class, the capture of government by the billionaire class and corporations, which has distorted the country and created this grotesque social inequality. Um, that and there's nothing anyone seems to be able to do about it in either of the two ruling parties. Um, that all it's dangerous, mostly because there doesn't seem any way out. There doesn't seem any exit. There doesn't seem any ability to reform the system from within. Biden hadn't done it. He hadn't even raised the minimum wage. Remember the $2,000 stimulus checks he promised, and the Build Back Better bill, and uh, free community college. I mean, the long list of stuff as a candidate he and the Democratic Party proposed, none of which happened. So, people attack Trump for these fantasy-driven promises and visions, and they are fantasy vision, but so are the promises of the Democratic Party, and that's really dangerous.
I want to get into your time during the first Gulf War. You were arrested twice, it looks like, maybe more, but from what I can tell, once by the United States military and another time by Iraqis. So you were imprisoned by
I
both
wasn't,
sides at
I
some
wasn't
point?
arrested by the Iraqis. I was in the middle of the Basra Shiite uprising. I was taken prisoner, so it was a little worse than that. And I was a prisoner for a week with the Iraqi Republican Guard. That was immediately after the first Gulf War. Well, I didn't participate in the pool system, where the dog and pony shows that the military sets up, where they drive you out to some canned event and then drive you back and you write it up. Well, I wasn't about to do that. First of all, I'd probably been in more combat than anybody in the U.S. military, with the exception of maybe the Vietnam vets, who at that point were colonels usually or above. Um, and I speak Arabic, so I was not going to play their game. And I was picked up by the MPs on my own. I was sleeping out in the desert, usually with Bedouins, um, uh, and I had my press credentials taken from me, but I didn't need them. Didn't, I didn't use them. I didn't play their game, uh, and and that's, the irony of it is that you had a press policy. This was the first Gulf War. It was really a reaction to Vietnam. What they hadn't understood, the military, in particular the army, is that most of the press over there hadn't been anywhere near a war. And number one, having covered lots of wars, it's only about 10 or 15% of the people who actually want to go out in combat. The rest want to stay in the hotel and play war reporter. The photographers are a little more honest, of course, because they have to get the pictures. And they were all willing to dance to whatever tune the military played. In fact, when I got over there, I immediately broke the rules. You're not supposed to go out without an escort. The next day went out without an escort. And the other reporters from the New York Times wrote a letter to the foreign editor and said that I was destroying the New York Times relationship with the military because I wasn't abiding by the rules. Fortunately for me, a veteran reporter, R.W. Apple, Johnny Apple, was in Saudi Arabia running the coverage. He had covered Vietnam, and he hit the roof. He called a meeting, and I was there. He dressed them down and said, we don't work for the U.S. military. But without him, I probably would have been shipped back. So, yeah, most reporters at every war I've covered, and I have full sympathy with people who don't want to go out and do that work. It's really dangerous. And something's probably wrong with most of us who do it or did it. But then you shouldn't be there because it's dishonest. You start reporting propaganda, and that is used to discredit the reporting that those of us who are out in combat zones are actually providing, and they use it as a weapon against real reporters. So I have a great deal of anger for those reporters who play that game because that was very effectively used to cast doubt or cast aspersions on the reporting that those of us who were in the field were doing.
Yeah, it sounds to me like things haven't really changed a whole lot. If this was going on in the early 90s with the first Gulf War, controlling the narrative, the military controlling the narrative, and many, as you describe, even reporters going along with it, saying, hey, we want to stay in the good graces of the US military. And luckily you did have somebody there saying, hey, wait a minute, we're journalists. We're not catering to that. But it's disheartening to hear that even in the early 90s, you had reporters and the military trying to control the narrative and reporters going along with it. So have things gotten even worse from them, or
So
has it
that's
always been like this?
true. I mean, that was true in Salvador. You had reporters who really never really wanted to go out, and we call them handout men and women, which meant they were getting handouts from the embassy.
Hmm.
Uh, and when big newspapers, I wasn't reporting for the New York Times when I covered the war in Salvador, and the reporter there was a woman. She was awful. And so what she was reporting was diametrically opposed to what those of us who were actually out in the combat zones, in the conflict zones, were reporting. And because of the weight of the New York Times, it was really difficult. There was a lot of pressure on us. So no, that's true in every war. Uh, that was true in Vietnam. It's always true. The numbers of reporters who really actually go out are a small percentage, and that's the way the military likes it. In the case of uh, Iraq, I mean, uh, they've really made the press captive. So I had friends who were embedded in Iraq, and what you get is the lie of omission. It's the things you see. I mean, for instance, checkpoints. So families would approach a checkpoint, it would be dark, they wouldn't see it, or they'd be going too fast, or the soldiers and Marines were just nervous, or whatever. And they'd they'd light it up in the parlance of military language, which everybody, including the children in the cars, were either killed or very badly wounded. If you were embedded with a unit that did that and you reported it, you were instantly unembedded the next day. So friends of mine who saw that stuff just didn't report it. And the lie of omission is still a lie. So that's what happens. They control the narrative, and when things happen like that are war crimes, it doesn't get reported because you won't have access if you do report it.
And that doesn't sound uniquely American. What happened when you were arrested and taken prisoner by the Iraqis?
Well, I was with the rebels, and I was in Basra and ran into Iraqi Republican Guard soldiers who hauled me out of my Jeep. I was with Neil Conan from NPR, shoved us into the back seat, put the barrel of an AK-47 to our heads, and drove off into the desert. And that's a very frightening moment because you don't know if after 30 minutes they're just going to roll you out the door and blow you away. I mean, you're a refuse. I mean, I think the fact that I spoke Arabic was key. I mean, it's a long story, but I was then kind of put with a light armor battalion that was trying to make its way north to Baghdad, and we got ambushed very bad, 16 hours of fighting. We didn't make it. We literally, there was no clean water because the U.S. had bombed all the water purification plants along with the electrical grid. We were literally drinking water out of mud puddles. And then finally, the last day, I was put on a helicopter and sent to Baghdad and turned over to the secret police, which was pretty unpleasant 24 hours, and then released to the Red Cross.
Why did they imprison you?
Well, because I was I was an American journalist with no permission to be in Iraq in the middle of a combat zone. I'd rented the Jeep in Kuwait. You have to sign a statement that you won't take it out of the country. Not Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. So I'd driven the Jeep all the way through Kuwait into Iraq, which meant that the rental agreement was no good, and the New York Times had to write a check for $36,000 or however, I don't know how much it was at the time, to pay for the Jeep. But yeah, no, I had no authorization to be there, so that's why. I mean, they didn't
So
know who
they're
I
also
was. They didn't know if I was a
so
spy.
right, right. Um, so they want to give journalists authorization. So is it very similar? I mean, do you see the same sort of controlling of the narrative happening
Oh,
on other
yeah,
sides as well?
that's happening in Ukraine. It's why, if you watch closely, for those of us who know how it works, the reporters are escorted out to a combat zone or front line. I mean, Ukraine's a kind of funny war. You have some situations where it's kind of like World War One, but largely it's a artillery duel between artillery pieces with hundreds of miles of front lines. So you're escorted out. You are given some, interviews under with a minder, and then you're brought back. There's no real independent reporting out of Ukraine at all, on either side. I mean, that's what you learn in war. I mean, both sides lie like they breathe. I don't trust anyone in a war zone. I mean, they consider the lie to be a legitimate weapon of war. Every side does, and that's why you need independent reporters who are not tied to one side or another if you really want to find out what's going on.
It's really difficult though if you're independent and you're not tied to one side or the other, or you don't share maybe their sentiment, then they're not necessarily going to let you follow them around. I mean,
Yeah,
the
well,
the ones that I've
dangerous.
seen,
Sure, but you can get up to a combat zone if you on your own and talk your way into units. I actually spent in the first Gulf War a lot of time with the Marine Corps because the Marines, the Army was running the press, and the Army was giving itself all the press, and so the Marines saw the press restrictions as just one more Army conspiracy against the Marine Corps. In fact, I had a Marine Corps uniform. I was spent a lot of time with First Battalion, First Marines. I was given a uniform. The colonel in charge, fortunately, he was a really interesting guy. His wife was a journalist, so he understood what I did for a living. And he said, if the generals come over, just back away, and if somebody says something, I'll tell them you're a reservist. I mean, he completely covered for me. So you can, once you get out, I mean, there's total chaos. I mean, when you get into a combat area, it's very hard for them to restrict you. They don't have the superstructure to set up the roadblocks and check you. I'm talking about when you're actually in combat. So I mean, the war in Salvador was fascinating because um, we traveled with both sides. Very rare. We traveled with the FMLN rebels and with the army back and forth.
hmm.
Uh, and that doesn't happen very much. Usually, you're with one side or another.
And when you see both sides of this, I think a lot of people have this idea that when it comes to war, there's a good side and there's a bad side. There's clearly a side committing atrocities and evils, and the other side are the good guys, are the heroes, they're defending. What has been your experience in covering all of these wars when it comes to that? I mean, uh, I suppose, is there a good side and a bad side usually?
Well, I would say let's take the war in Bosnia. So I would say 90% of the atrocities were committed by the Serbs. That doesn't mean the Muslims didn't commit atrocities, but they didn't commit them on the level that the Serbs did. Are there good guys or bad sides? Well, once you pick up the instrument of war, it's all evil. But I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo. It was being during the war. It was being hit with 300 to 400 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, a couple dozen wounded a day. When I got to the city, 45 foreign reporters had already been killed. We knew that if the Serbs broke through, there were trench systems around the city. We knew that if they broke through those trenches, a third of the city would probably be slaughtered and the rest would be driven into displacement or refugee camps. And that wasn't conjecture because that's what they did in the Drina Valley. That's what they did in Vukovar. So at that point, you fully understand why someone would pick up a weapon, but it doesn't save you from the poison of war. I mean, it empowered the mafia in Sarajevo because they already had weapons and a penchant for violence. And they set up the first roadblocks and to hold back the Serbs. And when they weren't shooting at the Serbs, they were raiding the apartments of ethnic Serbs who remained in the city and looting them and often executing them. So war is a nasty business. It is really the kind of most purest expression of death, and it's never black and white. I mean, that's like Ukraine. I mean, I was in Eastern Europe in 1989, covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, was there when the promises were made to Moscow not to extend the borders of a unified Germany, not to extend NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany, a promise that was broken for a couple reasons. One, billions of dollars in arms sales, and two, because of the hubris of the United States that saw Russia as broken and not important. I mean, that's when we started hearing about a unipolar world, etc. So I'm not defending what Putin did in Ukraine, but was clearly provoked. I mean, there were constant protestations out of Moscow about expanding NATO up to the Russian border. And in many ways, Ukraine became not officially a de facto NATO country, especially after the coup of 2014. But that speaking in that kind of nuance or historical, giving it historical context, especially when you have this jingoism about war pervading a society, people can't hear it. They can't hear it.
And you still do condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a war crime. I mean, but it was preventable. I believe it was preventable. I think that if Ukraine had been remained neutral or accepted a kind of neutral state status on the border of Russia. Remember, Russia was invaded twice in the last century, largely through Ukraine. First in the First World War, and then again in the Second World War. And the century before that, Napoleon did the same thing. So, there was legitimate historical trauma. There was no reason for NATO to encroach, build missile bases 100 miles from the Russian border. So, yeah, but in the end, of course, they were baited and they took the bait, and it is a war crime without question. I don't support it's a proxy war. Proxy war. I covered many of them. Are very cynical. The goals now in terms of funding and arming Ukraine has very little to do with Ukraine. It has to do with degrading the Russian military, isolating Putin from Europe, which they've succeeded in doing, although pushing him into the embrace of China, which is counterproductive. And I don't think it's going to work, but of course the goal is to bring him down, to put in a more pliant or a regime that they can control, as they did under Yeltsin.
So you're saying it is a proxy war or it isn't? Sorry,
Yeah,
I
no,
didn't
it
catch
is.
that.
Really,
It
it's a
is.
proxy war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to talk, I want to go back to your time in the Middle East and talk about when Saddam Hussein put you on a kill list, essentially. So there was a bounty out for you and some other journalists. That
Right.
must have been
So,
scary.
oh, I've kind of seen it all. I had a lot of other moments that were far worse than that. Well, the Iraqis withdrew below the 38th parallel, so the Kurdish northern area of Iraq was no longer under Iraqi control. So we used to go in, journalists used to go in over the border from Turkey, and it was fascinating because without Iraqi control, we could really in real time see the brutality of Saddam Hussein's regime, his torture centers, mass graves. I was at the exhumation of one mass grave of 1,500 soldiers who had refused to fight Kurdish, and they were all executed. The torture videos of executions and tortures. We were in these clandestine torture centers. We were interviewing victims, and Saddam was furious. So he said that any reporter who reported out of northern Iraq would not be allowed to go to Baghdad. So the TV stations, the networks didn't really want to go because they liked they wanted to stand at the top of the Al Rashid Hotel and do a live stand up for CNN or whatever. So there weren't a lot of us up there, and I was writing these front page stories for the New York Times, and then finally, there's always divisions. So there were these Kurdish militias. They were called Josh, which remained loyal to Saddam Hussein, but they could infiltrate into the Kurdish area, and they were sent up to kill any aid worker or journalist who was working in northern Iraq, and they did. They killed Lizzie Schmidt, photographer. They severely wounded a Swedish television crew that was up there. They put a bomb under their van. They shot a very badly wounded a care worker for care. I mean, so it was dangerous, but I was working for the New York Times. I had resources, so I had 7 bodyguards with me in 2 Jeeps, and everybody kept their AK-47 out the window. And so they would try and ambush you around dusk so that they didn't want to get killed. But if you had 2 Jeeps and you had that kind of firepower, it meant they might be able to shoot up one Jeep, but they probably wouldn't shoot up the other, which would kill them. So and we all slept in the same room. Everybody would sleep in a different corner so that if somebody actually burst through the door and started firing, somebody from another angle would be able to kill them. So, yeah. So they didn't get me. The sad part is that if they had, it was only $1,000, which I found very insulting. I thought I was worth far more than that. I guess not. Not to Saddam Hussein.
So now this was the first Iraq War, is that right? That's when this happened?
This was after the first Iraq War. Yeah.
It was after. So that's interesting. You've seen all of the atrocities of Saddam Hussein, reporting on this, seeing them firsthand, yet you're known for being against the Iraq War, at least the second Iraq War.
Right.
Why is that? I mean, because this is why people say we should go to war.
Well, that's very cynical, because if you actually know the history of Iraq, so I was in the Shiite uprising. That's when I was taken prisoner, and the Shiites are allied with Iran, and the U.S. did not want the Shiites to overthrow Saddam Hussein because they didn't want an Iranian-dominated Iraq, which, by the way, is now what we have. And so they allowed Saddam Hussein. So the Shiite uprising took whole parts of the city. You actually had defections of military units. When we were ambushed, I was with a guard unit, and I remember everybody shouting back and forth, whether it was askari. Askari is the Arabic word for army. Are we being ambushed by an army unit, or are we being ambushed by a bunch of kids who were just given an AK-47? Fortunately for us, it was a bunch of kids who didn't know what they were doing, because in a classic ambush, you disable the front and lead vehicles so the rest of the column is bottled up, which they didn't do. So we were actually able to get out of the town and create a kind of circle, and then use 50 caliber weapons and pretty heavy stuff. And then it was awful. I mean, they were kids. They didn't know one end of a gun from another, and then a lot of them were captured and lined up against a wall and shot. So Saddam Hussein appealed to the U.S. military, because his helicopters were grounded, his combat helicopters, to break the uprising. They let him put them up in the air. And roughly 30,000 Shia were killed in that uprising. In the Kurdish areas, you had a complete betrayal of the Kurds, because it's a long story. But at one point, when Saddam was kind of pro-Soviet, this was before the Iran-Iraq War, which ran from 1980 to 1988. Through the Shah of Iran, Kurds were being armed by the U.S. And then they signed Iran and Iraq. There were border disputes between the two countries. They signed something called the Algiers Agreement, and suddenly the arms were shut off to the Kurdish rebels, the Peshmerga. And Saddam went up there and carried out horrific ethnic cleansing, dynamiting whole towns into rubble, executing, the thousands of people were killed. And then during the Iran-Iraq War, because of the 1979 revolution in Iran, we sided and gave military aid to Iraq. And when the Kurds, then the Iranians began to give money, weapons, and support to the Kurds again to create an uprising, Saddam went in there and in the town of Halabja dropped poison gas on the town, killed 5,000 people immediately, and severely injured another 10,000. And by the way, all my bodyguards were from Halabja, because I knew that if they were from that town, most of their family had been killed, and therefore I could trust all of them. So the idea that he kills his own people, we were completely complicit. In that, and that's not, frankly, a justification. And all of us who'd covered Iraq knew that we wouldn't be greeted as a liberator. I mean, this was just a non-reality based belief system. So yeah, I was completely opposed to the. Saddam was broken. He didn't have weapons of mass destruction. I knew, because I covered the UN inspection teams that destroyed his stockpiles. Because of the sanctions, he couldn't. His military was a mess. He was not a threat to his neighbors. He wasn't a threat to us. And going in there was probably the greatest strategic blunder, you could argue, in American history. And the last 20 years, I think, proves that point. So yeah, I was very outspoken against the invasion of Iraq.
Was he a threat to his own people?
Well, he was a brutal, horrible dictator. But we support all sorts of dictators. If they're convenient to our interests, we could start with the Shah of Iran. So yeah, he was brutal and awful. There's no question. But we were complicit in his campaigns of genocide against the Shia and the Kurds. So people don't know that, but they would say he kills his own people. Well, yes, he does, but he did with our collusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because that is the excuse that many would use in order to justify going into war, is that this is a brutal dictator. We have to stop them. They kill their own people. And so we, as the American heroes, need to go in and do something to save these people. We have to stop. We have to stop them. I'm curious. Excuse me.
Well, yeah, but
Do you have
I covered Rios Montt. Rios Montt,
Yeah.
who we were armed under the Reagan administration, and that the rest of the world doesn't buy that, because they see how, if a brutal dictator, Marcos in the Philippines, I mean, it's a long list. If they're willing to essentially, that famous line about Somoza in Nicaragua, I think Roosevelt said it, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. I mean, I covered the war in Salvador. So in Salvador, they go into a village, they kill, I don't know, 20, 30 people, with a few exceptions, like the El Masote massacre. In Guatemala, in the highlands, they would go in on an afternoon and kill 300 people. And they were completely backed by the U.S. So that kind of line works on a very gullible and ignorant American public, but it doesn't work. I mean, look, Salvador Allende is overthrown. Pinochet's put in power. Who did it? We did it.
Yeah.
Mossadegh in Iran is overthrown to put in a horrible dictator, the Shah. Who did it? We did it. So, yeah, that is that is a form of very mendacious advertising.
Well, I think it stems back from World War II. There's this idea we want to liberate, we want to save people, we want to stop genocides. And I think a lot of Americans, when it comes to the military and wars, feel very proud of America for liberating and preventing genocide, and want to continue seeing us do this over and over and over again.
Let me just question that. We didn't prevent genocide. they were fully aware of the death camps, and there were repeated requests to bomb the rail lines, which was not a strategic priority. So up until almost the end, uh, uh, train cars full of Jews and Gypsies and everyone else were being funneled to the death camps. Um, that's the first part. And second of all, we ignore the war in the South Pacific. My uncle fought in the South Pacific, and they didn't take any Japanese prisoners. They killed them all. So, we talk a lot about the war against the Nazis. We don't see a lot about the war in the South Pacific, and it was completely racialized, by the way. The Germans were white, but the Japanese were not, and they played on that horrible racism. So,
Hmm.
uh, I think even in the case of World War II, it's a kind of mythology. My uncle was destroyed by the war; he was wounded, but he came back and just drank himself to death. I mean, it was savage. So, and then you've got the issue of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. You've got the issue of the firebombing of not just Tokyo, but almost the reason they dropped bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima because most of the rest of the Japanese city had been firebombed in the way that Dresden had,
Hmm.
these were civilians. I mean, and these were war crimes without question. So once you get down into the actual details and nuances of any war, it's very, very dirty, and it isn't quite as black and white. Everyone should go read Kurt Vonnegut's wonderful novel Slaughterhouse Five. He was actually a prisoner of war in Dresden when we firebombed the city.
So you say you're not a pacifist. Is there a time, and you're even saying that, yes, there are these evil dictators like Saddam Hussein who do commit atrocities against their own people, and this is going on all around the world. Is there a time then when you think there should be a war? When would that time be?
Well, if you face an existential threat, a real one. So I would say in Sarajevo, I fully understood why people picked up a weapon. I got it. It didn't save them from the perversions and sickness of violence. But that's why for me war is always tragic. But I get it. I get why a Ukrainian would fight against her. I get it.
Right.
But I'll tell you, having been in war zones, it's really ugly and really awful. And it perverts and destroys both those who are perpetrating the war and those who are attempting to fight off the aggression. It's a equal opportunity sickness, and you never recover from it.
Let me rephrase it. Is there a time when the United States should go and intervene and help in a war? I understand people defending themselves and their own homes. I totally get that. No matter whose side is right or wrong, people themselves are not in control of their government largely. I have no control over the United States government. And I imagine that the Ukrainian people who are fighting don't have any control over theirs as well. So I understand self defense. I understand fighting for your own homeland, your own country. But is there a time when the United States should intervene and help out another country, in your view?
Very rarely, I would say, in the case of Bosnia, yes, but that was air power. They used air power because when the war began, they put an embargo. So the Muslims, the Muslim-led government, there were actually Serbs who stayed with the Muslims, but the Muslim-led government was unable to get heavy weapons. So we were being hit with Katyusha rockets, 90 millimeter tank rounds, the Soviet equivalent of 155 howitzers. These are really big, devastating pieces of artillery, and but they put a embargo so that you couldn't get any weapon. I think the largest mortars the Bosnians had were about 60 millimeter, which you can carry on your back. So you had that embargo, and then you had the world sit by for 3.5 years while people were just slaughtered. And the it's a long story, but the breakdown of the Srebrenica and Jepa and the safe areas triggered the UN because the whole UN peacekeepers, which were largely ineffectual, everything was collapsing. So you finally had NATO bomb the Serb positions, which were around the city. The city was completely surrounded, and that took away the heavy artillery. And at that point, I was with the Bosnian army when we made a huge push out across Bosnia, because without that kind of heavy artillery, the Serbs, it was an equal fight. So, yeah, there are moments when intervention is justified. Um, but I would say in most cases, those times when we attempt to, I mean, look at the Middle East, Libya. Libya is a mess. We just turned it into a failed state. And I knew Gaddafi. I interviewed him twice. He was awful, but compared to what they have now, Iraq compared to what they have, Iraq's destroyed, not even a unified country anymore. Syria, that it has to be done very carefully and very judiciously, and you have to really come out of have deep experience in the region to understand the consequences. And that it's just been one Afghanistan, just one debacle after another, because it's a preponderant use of force without thought. So yes, there are moments, but it's very, very rare. And the idea that we are going to go around and be the policemen of the world, is life better in Iraq? I mean, it was horrible under Saddam, but it's not better now.
Hmm.
So is it better in Libya? No, it's definitely not better in Libya. So these interventions have made things worse. We created the caliphate. I mean, it was crazy. We pumped in $500 million worth of weapons into Syria. Well, every jihadist, it was a bazaar. They went and got them, created. I mean, then we ended up bombing the people we'd armed. I mean, it was lunacy. So, uh, yeah, very, very rarely.
You said that your imprisonment by the Iraqis was not the worst thing that happened to you or the worst thing that you saw. What would you say? I mean, I hate to ask you to relive it, but what would you say was the worst thing that you saw or experienced in
Well, I
all of your
was in a lot
time?
of combat. I mean, ambushes where guys in front of me had the backs of their heads blown off, kind of stuff. I mean, some of the scariest moments were actually not in combat. So I was taken prisoner in northern Iraq with Tom Gelton from NPR when we bumped into a Contra unit, and the Contras were furious because they thought we were all spies for the Sandinistas, and they marched us into a cornfield at gunpoint and radioed back to the base in Honduras to see whether they should shoot us, kill us. So we're sitting there waiting for a radio message, and could have gone either way. Stuff like that.
Um, you have just such an impressive career as a journalist, as a foreign correspondent with all of these experiences. And, what makes this so interesting is that you keep during that time, you kept putting yourself in these war after war after war, conflict after conflict after conflict. I mean, most American military, they serve and then they go home after that conflict. They get to go home and they can talk about the time they had in battle for those couple of years or few years, but then that's it. But for you, it was a couple of decades of being constantly put into these situations in order to bring us the true story, which is really incredible. What kind of an effect has it had on you personally to see all of this? I mean, look, I've seen very little, but what I did see in my short time in the West Bank, even, which wasn't even a direct conflict zone, but just seeing having machine guns around and being pointed, and these things were very traumatizing even for me. I couldn't, but what you've experienced is, I mean, soldiers come back with PTSD after fighting a shorter period of time in a combat zone. And you're talking a couple of decades of doing this. I mean, how are you not drinking yourself into oblivion at this
Yeah,
point?
I tried that. It didn't work. I don't drink anymore. So yeah, of course you carry out trauma. I would say the dividing line is I never killed anyone, and that's a big dividing line. It was actually in Gaza. I spent a lot of time in Gaza. So I had taken a fellowship at Harvard and then was sent back by the New York Times to Gaza, and was at an ambush. Was at not an ambush because the Palestinians didn't have any weapons. They were throwing Molotov cocktails, and an Israeli sniper killed a 19-year-old kid, a few feet away from me. And everybody's running down the road, and somebody's carrying his arm, one arm or a leg or something. And I'm thinking, I got to stop. This is crazy. I don't need to know what it feels like. I know what it feels like. But I would say, yeah, the fact that I didn't kill anyone is important. I never hurt anyone. But yeah, of course, you carry that kind of trauma. It's inevitable, mostly through nightmares, I would say. Um, uh, but there are soldiers call it. I don't want to defend what we do, and I wrote a book called "War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning" about the culture of war. Uh, and I only brought myself into the book to expose a moral failing. And I argued that we were addicted to that, what soldiers or Marines call the combat high. It's real. Those adrenaline rushes. You finally become, and war photographers and war correspondents are a small fraternity. They leap from war to war to war. So I was covering conflicts all over the globe with people I'd known for years. In fact, last war I covered was Kosovo. There were two reporters there who we'd all covered the war in El Salvador 20 years earlier. Uh, and it is a kind of sickness, and I liken it. I never did drugs, but I liken it to a drug addiction. So you finally can't cope with a world not at war. You at least, however perverted and distorted and bizarre that world is, at least it's one you understand, and you're with people who you can communicate that too, so it's very hard to break free. I mean, I just spoke in Austin and went to the gym. I mean, that's part of the way I deal with this. I work out every day. I went to the gym and I was lifting weights with a ex-helicopter Army helicopter pilot who'd done 10 tours in Iraq. I get it. uh, those military, you're right, some of them only do a tour, but a lot of them go back for tour after tour after tour. I mean, Ron Kovic, born on the 4th of July, well, as a friend of mine, he did three tours in Vietnam before he was paralyzed.
Yeah. When you first started, the first time that you saw these conflicts, I mean, did it take some sort of desensitizing a bit? I mean, were you shocked at first, traumatized at first, and then over time you just sort of see death
Yeah,
and stop?
I would say it's, first of all, you have the adrenaline rush, right? You become kind of numb. You have to, because you're a reporter. I mean, it's kind of clinical. You have to find how many people are dead. Where were they shot? Were they shot in the back of the head? And you have to gather that information because you're going to publish it that day. So it usually hits you later. I was fortunate in that when I covered the war in Salvador, the older reporters who had been sent to cover the war had covered the war in Vietnam, and they didn't speak Spanish. I spoke Spanish, and so I would go out with them and translate for them. I'd write my own stories too, but they'd pay me. I was a freelancer when I began, but they taught me how to cover war. And we used to say there's two types of reporters or photographers who get killed in war: the very green, who come and just do something very stupid, or the ones who have been around so long they become jaded. And that I
Mm.
certainly became very jaded. Your perimeter of fear shrinks. So when we were ambushed, when I was a prisoner in Iraq, uh, I it's very hard to tell. You spend a lot of time in a firefight trying to find out where the fire is coming from. It's really difficult because you want to know, where the shooting is coming from. And we dove into dirt. I was actually in a ditch, and I immediately, instinctively looked up on the mud wall behind me to see if there were any bullets going into the wall, because then I would know that the fire was being directed towards me. And there weren't. And I remember thinking, you should try and be scared. Now, that doesn't mean that, when that circle or perimeter is breached, you're not terrified. I have had moments where I thought I was going to die, and terror is the right word. I mean, it is terrifying. But you learn to navigate that landscape, and so you become accustomed to coping with it. That takes a lot of time, of course. You know this. You learn the sounds. I mean, I know immediately the caliber of a weapon by the sound of the bullet, especially a sniper rifle, which is always frightening, but has a very sharp kind of crack to it. I know the difference between incoming, outcoming. I mean, you as any soldier or Marine does, you learn to become familiar and cope in this bizarre environment. But yeah, there's a kind of numbness and a cynicism and a black humor that comes with it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for me. It was always hard to see dead children, That was never easy. That never got easy.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine all the things that you've seen, but it just really incredible life history. Have you thought about covering going back and let's say going into Ukraine and
No, no.
no?
I After that ambush at Netzarim Junction in Gaza, I made a conscious decision because what the problem is that it is very hard to, even to this day, you feel very alienated from the world around you, and you want to go back one more time. And I had three friends who did that, and they were all killed: Kurt Schork, Elizabeth Newfer, Michael Kelly. They were all Kelly and Newfer were killed in the second Iraq War. Kurt was killed in an ambush along with another friend of mine, Miguel Gil Moreno, in Sierra Leone. And we would have these conversations, especially with Kurt, who I worked with for 10 years in northern Iraq, Sarajevo, and Kosovo. We knew, you don't stay lucky forever. And you don't stay emotionally and physically as resilient. I mean, I was in my 40s when I stopped. It's a young person's game. You got to run, you got to move. It takes a physical toll, an emotional toll, psychological toll. You're not eating very well. You're sick all the time. You're living in constant stress. So, no, I realized I forced myself to stop. That said, it took me 3 years, I would say, roughly, to adjust.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I knew it was time to do something else.
Yeah, I would imagine you can't keep that up for too long. It is very difficult. Do you have any advice for journalists that are wanting to embed themselves in these sorts of conflicts?
Well, it doesn't matter what advice anybody would have given me when I was young because I would have ignored it. It's kind of in your DNA. You either do it or you don't. And there are people who go out and they're probably sane people who have their first taste of combat and realize this is really stupid and really dangerous. I don't want to do it anymore. And then there are people like us who are just that kind of flirtation with death. It's how close can we get? And it may be terrifying, but by that night in the bar, it's some great cosmic joke that you want to go play the game again. I don't know. There's somebody can unpack that psychologically. I don't think it's healthy, but that is kind of the kind of reaction that people who do this for a long time have. Um, I mean, my advice would be don't do it, but I also know that if you're driven like I was, that advice would be ignored completely.
Well, all of these experiences, I think, lend more, make your perspective of being so against war and being the voice that you are. It just makes it so much more intriguing that you yourself have seen it. I mean, there's many who are very, actively, vocally against wars, against American interventionism, but you've actually seen it firsthand, and you've seen the cost that it's caused people on both sides. And I think that is incredibly, really incredibly important to have people like you who've seen all of these conflicts, who've been in all of them, to then come out and say, yeah, we just should not be doing this. You'd think that there would be more coming out of the military that would say this was devastating, damaging, psychologically, emotionally, physically, all those things that you mentioned. um,
But there are, veterans for peace. There are. I mean, I think
yeah.
what angers all of us, including I think just about anyone in the military, is that the people making these decisions, for instance, about the wars in Iraq, they never served in the military. The Dick Cheneys and Richard Pearls and uh, you know George Bushes, and I mean, you could make a pretty strong argument to Bush went AWOL, and Cheney, what do you have, three deferments, which is what Clinton also had. I mean, so they, what's in the end, I'm not a pacifist, but I don't believe in sending the military into all the fiascos that were sent in, because it's these kids. Only 1% of the U.S. population who are usually economically disadvantaged pay the price. My own family, half of my family comes out of Maine. They're all vets, lower working poor. They pay the price. And so I think what's galling and angering is that the people who make these decisions don't know anything about war. I mean, then you have all the shills for war, Robert Kagan and Elliot Abrams and Crystal, and They don't go into the military. Their kids don't go into the military. It's appalling. That's what's really angry. So there are moments when a country has to use force to prevent existential threats. I mean, I think history bears that out. But you want people who make those decisions to understand the instrument of war. I mean, the greatest warning against the military industrial complex came from Eisenhower because he knew he'd been there.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight in this conversation. And I know, it's like one of those, I feel like I should say thank you for your service. I mean,
I'll do for that.
um,
That always makes most of the veterans I know want to vomit.
I know it, but at the same time, we do think, we're always thanking vets or whatever, but as a journalist, there is a service that you are doing for journalism, for real news, for the truth. And it isn't done as often. And as you mentioned, a lot of times journalists just kind of follow along wherever the military tells them to go, or they're sitting back at the base waiting for their talking points. And I mean, what you are doing, what you've done in your career and what you continue to do just really has been a great service to us all because we have to have people like you. There have to be people brave enough to actually go out there and risk their lives. It's insane. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah,
It's
totally
insane.
insane.
But we
Yeah.
have to have that. Otherwise, we will always remain in the dark and we just end up with what they tell us, the propaganda. And so, yeah, really impressive career. Thank you for being here tonight to talk more about it with us. I think a lot of people, many people know who you are. I've known of you for many years, but really when I started looking into your past, I mean, just phenomenal experiences that you've had. So thank you for sharing some of them, just even a glimpse of them with us tonight. Really appreciate it.
And everything is on chrishedges.substack.com, including my weekly show on the Real News. It's all centralized and comes out there.
Okay, great. And I will definitely have that link down below, and people can definitely watch more, read more. I'm very intrigued and fascinated. So thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks, Kim.